Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really digging into something foundational, a source you sent over. Chapter 2 of Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah, this chapter is, it's really where so much of the modern understanding starts to take shape.
Exactly, and we're not just skimming. We want to get into the texture, the stories, the moments where you can almost feel the understanding shifting.
Think of it as us guiding you through how those first encounters with trauma survivors really threw a wrench in the works, showed the limits of what they thought they knew.
And pointed towards this idea that the past isn't just back there, it's alive right now in the body.
That's the core of it. Our mission here is really to unpack that, how they started to realize the past lives on in the present.
Okay, so let's dive in. The author starts with his early days at the VA clinic. This is years after Vietnam ended, right?
Right, years after. But for the vets coming in, the war was absolutely not over.
And he uses the story of Tom to illustrate this.
Yeah, Tom.
Yep.
A guy struggling years later, agitated, avoiding his family on holidays.
That detail about avoiding the family, especially the kids, is brutal.
Terrified he'd be a monster because simple things, noises would just set him off. He'd end up drinking or, riding his motorcycle dangerously just to cope.
And the author makes it personal, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Wondering about his own family, his father, uncle, his mother.
Yes, if they carried similar unspoken burdens from their own histories, their own traumas, it adds this layer of personal searching to the clinical observation.
It really grounds it. But what's truly staggering is the context back then. He talks about looking for resources.
In the VA library, yeah.
Sure.
5 years after the troops came home from Vietnam, looking for anything on war neurosis, shell shock.
And
Basically nothing current. It's hard to even imagine now.
seriously,
Nothing.
it tells you so much about how little the field is equipped or maybe even willing to look at it. The best he found was Cardner's book from 1941.
1941.
Yeah, written anticipating WWII casualties, but based on studying World War I veterans. So 40-year-old insights from a different war for guys dealing with Vietnam. That's inadequate, doesn't cover it.
Not even close. It points to this bigger issue. The chapter gets into this wall of denial.
Not just institutional, but societal, too.
Exactly. The idea that, look, society often doesn't want to really know what soldiers endure, or, how common childhood abuse is, molestation, physical abuse, or domestic violence, the source says nearly a third of couples experience it.
We like the idea of families as safe havens, our country as, enlightened. Facing the darkness is tough.
It is. And if it's hard for us as observers, imagine how hard it is for the person who lived it to consciously remember.
So that avoidance, using drugs, alcohol, self-harm, it's presented as a way to block it all out.
Desperate measures to cope with what he calls unbearable knowledge. It's not just forgetting, it's actively trying to numb an internal reality that feels unsurvivable.
And when people did try to talk, the symptoms were just off the map of existing diagnoses.
Completely. Let's get into those symptoms using Tom again. Flashbacks, obviously.
Right, the classic image of PTSD.
But it's more complex here.
Yeah.
For Tom, it wasn't just the ambush itself, it was what happened after the killing, the rape, that carried this paralyzing shame that was, in his words, almost worse.
Wow.
The source connects it even to Achilles, the rage and revenge after Patroclus. The consequence for Tom was this feeling he couldn't truly go home, not physically, but internally. He felt changed, maybe fundamentally damaged.
That the shame in the aftermath can be more wounding than the initial event.
Yeah.
That's heavy.
Then there's the emotional numbing. Just pervasive. Tom feeling distant, like his heart was frozen, living behind a glass wall from his own family.
Unable to feel deeply.
Yeah. And it wasn't just directed outward, it was toward himself, too. Hardly recognizing himself, feeling like he was watching his life from afar, like floating. Classic dissociation.
That feeling of being disconnected from yourself.
And this impacts something really unexpected. Imagination.
Imagination. How so?
He describes these Rorschach test experiments. Veterans showed two really concerning responses. Some just saw their trauma images superimposed onto the ink blots, like replaying the same old awful movie, no flexibility.
Stop.
Right. And others, they saw nothing, just a bunch of ink. They'd lost the ability to, let their minds play, find meaning, see possibilities.
So trauma can literally shut down your ability to imagine, to see beyond the immediate or the past.
It seems like it can hijack or just flatten those creative, flexible parts of the mind. And the common thread was the struggle to connect the past and present. The trauma became the defining thing, the sole source of meaning, paradoxically the only time they felt fully alive, even amidst horror.
Which makes the early treatment attempts seem almost doomed from the start.
Pretty much. At the VA, they were trying everything, diagnoses like alcoholism, depression, mood disorders, even schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Standard stuff.
Yeah, and the results.
Not good. Powerful drugs just created fog. Encouraging talk often triggered overwhelming flashbacks, made things worse, not better. A lot of people just dropped out.
Because the help was actually hurting them more.
Exactly. And the source points out this disconnected morning rounds focus on managing the symptoms, the suicidality, the self-destruction.
But not really digging into the causes. The abuse, the neglect, the violence that studies later showed were incredibly common in psychiatric patients.
Right. Over half reported those kinds of histories. But there was little attention to the ecology of their lives, what they were proud of, what they hoped for, who they loved, what actually mattered to them beyond the trauma.
It sounds very sterile.
It does.
Yeah.
Contrast that with the author's experience moonlighting at a Catholic hospital, just doing basic physical exams.
Yeah.
Patients would just start spilling out stories about their hard lives, and they'd visibly brighten up just from being heard, really listened to. Some even wondered aloud if they still needed electroshock therapy after just talking.
That small act of being seen and heard made that much difference.
Huge difference. And then there's Sylvia's story, critically important. 19, mute, terrified, being force-fed in the hospital. For her, with her history of childhood sexual abuse, that act of force-feeding meant to help felt like a gang rape.
Oh, wow. That's horrifying.
It led to this fundamental rule the author taught. If you do something to a patient that you would not do to your friends or children, consider whether you are unwittingly replicating a trauma from the patient's past.
That forces a completely different perspective on intervention, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You have to know the history.
Absolutely. You have to understand the potential meaning of your actions to that specific person. Around this time, though, the wider field was actually moving towards a more biological brain disease model.
So more focus on discrete disorders and presumably medication.
Yeah, partly driven by studies showing drugs alone sometimes outperform talk therapy for certain conditions. It was a move away from seeing problems as these complex, infinitely variable expressions of intolerable feelings in relationships.
Interesting tension there. Moving away from the relational, just as its importance, was becoming clear in these other contexts.
Exactly. But even with these limitations, there were these early glimmers, these hints of different ways to understand what was going on.
Like Cardner's idea.
Right. Cardner, again, calling traumatic neurosis a functional alteration of the personality, suggesting it wasn't just temporary upset, but a lasting change.
And the animal studies?
Seligman's dogs, yeah. The learned helplessness. The dogs who couldn't escape the shocks just gave up. Even when escape became possible later.
They had to be physically moved.
Physically dragged out to reteach their bodies that escape was possible. It raised this huge question. Do human trauma survivors also need physical experiences to restore that sense of agency, of control?
That maybe just talking isn't enough if the body learned helplessness.
Maybe. What if they need to move differently, physically experience safety or escape?
And there were biological clues too, right? Endorphins.
Yeah, Solomon's theories. And Beecher's observation back in WWII, wounded soldiers needing less morphine than expected. He guessed that strong emotions can block pain.
Which connects to that experiment with the veterans watching Platoon.
That's a striking one. Watching the intense combat film while holding their hand in ice water, most of them kept their hand in way longer, 30% longer.
Equivalent to a dose of morphine.
About 8 milligrams, yeah. It vividly showed how stress, activating those trauma pathways, could actually change the physical experience of pain.
Meanwhile, the drug revolution is gaining steam, pushing the chemical imbalance idea.
Right. And the source acknowledges drugs like SSRIs can help. They can provide relief, help people function, but they often suppress the problem rather than resolve it. They should be seen as adjuncts, tools, not the whole solution.
And then comes the game changer. Neuroimaging.
Huge. PET scans, fMRI. Suddenly you could look inside the working brain. It wasn't just studying the gasoline, the chemicals anymore. You could see the engine itself.
How different parts lit up, how they processed memory, sensation, emotion.
It completely transformed the understanding of trauma, showing how it affected the brain circuits.
And what this really started to reveal was how deeply the body is involved. The body keeps the score.
Yeah, and this idea that all trauma is pre-verbal.
Needing.
Meaning under extreme threat, language often fails. You don't calmly describe it. You scream, you freeze, you shut down. Victims become mute. Kids lose their tongues. That Macbeth quote sums it up. Tongue nor heart cannot conceive nor name thee.
The experience is too overwhelming for words.
Exactly. The whole organism just shifts into survival mode. The oldest parts of the brain, the reptilian brain, kick in with these pre-programmed escape plans: fight, flight, freeze.
And these parts have a direct line to the body, bypassing the thinking brain.
Pretty much. They partially shut down the higher conscious brain to pour all resources into immediate physical action. Your body moves before you consciously decide to. If you escape, you might eventually regain balance.
The source uses the brain from bottom to top model to explain this. Survival first.
Right. The brain's job number one: keep you alive. Register needs, map the world, generate energy, warn of danger, adjust actions.
And for us humans, doing that requires cooperation, connection.
Crucial point. Psychological problems often start when those basic survival functions get scrambled, or when our relationships or connections break down.
At the heart of it is the emotional brain.
Reptilian brain plus the limbic system. Constantly scanning, looking out for your welfare. Is this safe? Is this dangerous? Is this an opportunity? It releases hormones, creates those gut feelings, the tension, the racing heart.
Those physical sensations that direct our attention.
Massively influential, affecting everything from who you trust to what you eat, even if you're not consciously aware of why.
And mirror neurons play a role here too, like neural Wi-Fi.
Yeah, picking up on others' states, their movements, emotions, intentions. It's the basis for empathy, imitation, getting in sync with people.
But it makes us vulnerable.
Definitely. You can get pulled into someone else's anger or depression. And for trauma, especially relational trauma, the experience is often about not being seen, not being safely mirrored. So healing has to involve reactivating that safe mirroring and learning not to get hijacked.
Okay, so how does the brain actually process danger information comes in?
Through the senses, yeah. Eyes, ears, skin. It all converges in the thalamus. The source calls it the Kolk.
The Kolk, okay.
It integrates everything into a coherent story. This is what's happening to me.
And from there?
Two paths. A low road, super fast, straight to the amygdala.
The smoke detector.
Exactly. And a high road, slower, up to the frontal lobes, the thinking brain, for conscious assessment.
So the amygdala gets the alert almost instantly.
Before you even consciously know it's happening, it triggers the alarm based on incomplete data. Now, in trauma, that thalamus, the Kolk, can break down. It can't integrate the sensory input properly.
So the sensations get stored differently.
As fragments, isolated images, sounds, physical feelings, time freezes. The danger feels like it's happening right now, forever.
And the amygdala, the smoke detector, gets stuck on high alert.
Totally. It starts reacting to minor cues in the present as if they're the original threat. The veteran hearing a car backfire and diving for cover. The abuse survivor feeling intense shame from a seemingly innocent touch.
And these reactions, the startle, the rage, the numbing, the physical symptoms like migraines or gut issues, they just happen.
Often without conscious connection to the past trauma. It's playing out on the battlefield of their own bodies.
So the real challenge isn't just dealing with the memories.
It's gaining mastery over these internal sensations and emotions in the present moment. The first step, the source says, is sensing, naming, and identifying what is going on inside.
Stan's brain scan during a flashback really shows this, doesn't it?
Vividly. Amygdala blazing, left brain, language sequence offline. His body was reacting to the memory of the crash as if it were happening right then. Sweating, trembling, heart racing, normal if you just crashed, but debilitating when it's a memory.
And U2 scan, showing her brain basically shutting down during depersonalization.
Yeah, that helped explain why talk therapy was useless for her in those moments. If the thinking, feeling, remembering parts of your brain are offline, how can you process anything verbally?
It really highlights that the goal has to be about improving the present experience. Traumatic memories dominate because it's so hard to feel alive now.
Right. If you can't feel present, you go back to when you did feel intensely alive, even if it was terrifying.
So just desensitizing, making the triggers less potent, isn't the full picture.
It's not enough. It doesn't help you find joy in everyday life, connect with people, feel safe. You need to bring those parts of the brain that went offline back online.
We've covered a lot of ground here, tracing how these early insights pointed towards the body and brain's role.
Yeah, it's dense stuff. And if you listening are finding this deep dive helpful, if it's sparking things for you, maybe take a second to click the like button. It really helps us know we're on the right track.
Absolutely. And if you want to continue exploring these kinds of complex topics with us, really getting into the source material, Subscribing is the best way to make sure you catch our future deep dives.
Okay, so picking back up on the body's experience, the source comes back to that numbing, calls it maybe the worst symptom.
This real difficulty sensing what's happening inside.
Yeah, and it's linked to these unnuanced reactions. You go from 0 to 60, spaced out or enraged, because you miss the subtle internal cues of rising frustration or fear. You literally can't tell what's upsetting you sometimes.
And this disconnect from the body has real-world consequences.
Huge ones. Lack of self-protection, higher rates of being re-victimized, difficulty feeling pleasure, sensuality, meaning. It's all connected.
He even connects it back to William James in 1884.
Right. Sensory and sensibility. That woman James interviewed who felt she had no human sensations, like a void inside, despite having things to be happy about externally, and incomprehensible torture.
It sounds a lot like what we now call alexithymia.
Exactly. Difficulty identifying and describing emotions. They substitute language of action for that of emotion. Ask about danger, they say what they'd do, not what they'd feel.
And they experience emotions as physical symptoms.
Muscle pain, stomach problems, headaches. Instead of recognizing them as emotional signals. You see it a lot in eating disorders, apparently. And they struggle to read emotions in others' faces, too. It's a breakdown in that body-emotion awareness connection.
Which brings us straight to early relationships, doesn't it? How caregivers shape this internal landscape.
Fundamentally, responsive, attuned caregiving gives you a lifetime advantage, a buffer. This is Bowlby attachment theory.
We're wired to connect from birth. Babies are fascinated by faces, voices, sensitive to everything.
It's survival. You need to attach. If caregivers are responsive, you develop secure attachment, healthy social skills. It's this dance of attunement, starting physically, making the baby feel seen, understood.
But if the caregiver is abusive, neglectful.
The dance is broken, the child becomes defensive, scared, maybe hyperreactive, maybe shut down. They miss social cues, lose control, get rejected by peers. They might put up a tough front or just withdraw.
You get insecure attachment, chronically upset, or passive and withdrawn. Contact doesn't soothe them.
Or disorganized attachment. This often comes from abuse. Or when parents are overwhelmed by their own trauma, domestic violence loss, their own past abuse. They're inconsistent, frightening, or frightened. Traumatized parents often need help themselves to be attuned.
Beatrice Beebe's work showing the mother missing the baby's cues.
Yeah, intensifying interaction when the baby needs a break. It shows how easy it is to be out of tune without meaning to.
And the 9/11 study. Children whose mothers had PTSD were way more likely to have problems.
6 times more likely for emotional problems, 11 times for hyperaggression. Living with a traumatized parent takes a heavy toll.
So secure relationships teach you how to handle distress and how to be yourself, have interests, goals.
Right. The caregiver's calm response buffers your own fear. But if your needs are ignored or you feel resented,
you learn to expect rejection.
You cope by shutting down, acting like it doesn't matter. But inside, the body stays on high alert. That's dissociation again, simultaneously knowing and not knowing.
And these internal maps of the world of relationships, they get wired in deep.
Very deep, in the emotional brain. And you can't just change them by thinking differently. Kathy's story is a perfect example.
The one where she blamed herself for someone else's car trouble?
Yeah, and it spiraled into blaming herself for her childhood abuse when the author tried to use logic to be reasonable.
It just made her feel more alone.
Totally isolated. Confirmed her feeling that nobody gets it. It wasn't a rational belief problem. It was deeper, more visceral.
Which highlights the massive challenge for diagnosis.
Yeah.
How do you capture this complexity?
Exactly. The DSM-3 in 1980 brought in PTSD, which was huge for recognition.
But it had limitations from the start.
Yeah, that warning against using it for legal or insurance purposes, which, of course, is exactly how it ended up being used predominantly. It became incredibly powerful institutionally.
Insurance, research funding, training programs. It all got organized around these DSM categories.
And the DSM became a cultural touchstone, a big moneymaker for the APA. But the question lingers, did it actually help patients proportionally?
The author's own research, interviewing hundreds of survivors,
fed into this, yeah. And it coincided with the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences.
Which just blew the lid off how common this stuff is. Not just veterans, but everyday people, middle-class backgrounds.
Right. Only a third reported no adverse experiences. The numbers are stark: emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, witnessing domestic violence. Far more common than anyone wanted to believe.
And critically, these experiences aren't isolated. They stack up.
Incidents of abuse are never standalone events. The damage compounds with each ACE.
And the effects last a lifetime. School problems, work problems, financial issues.
And physical health. Obesity, heart disease, lung disease. The ACE study showed a direct link. The ongoing stress on the body keeps taking its toll.
It really connects the embodied trauma to long-term physical outcomes.
And it led to that fascinating counterintuitive idea, problems are really solutions.
The woman who became suicidal after weight loss surgery.
Yeah, Dr. Feliti's insight. Maybe her obesity, seen as the problem, was actually her solution, a way to feel safe, protected, numb. If you just remove the solution without understanding its function.
Other problems can pop up, like an addiction, swapping one for another.
Precisely. It shows why just slapping labels on complex cases doesn't work. Like Anthony, diagnosed with everything under the sun, but really just terrified and untrusting.
Or Maria, the teenager in foster care. Mute, aggressive, impulsive. A stack of diagnoses that didn't capture the core reality of her trauma history.
Exactly. These cases pushed for a new way of thinking, leading to the proposal for developmental trauma disorder, DTD.
To capture the effects of chronic interpersonal trauma in childhood.
Right. Exposure to multiple or prolonged events, often involving caregivers over long periods. The argument was the current system just failed these kids. They got no diagnosis or tons of unrelated ones.
Focusing on behavior control instead of the underlying trauma and lack of safety.
Yeah. It missed the developmental disruptions. Trying to shoehorn them into existing boxes just didn't work, obscured what was really going on, and led to piecemeal treatment.
Studies on abused kids back this up, showing widespread, lasting effects on cognition, emotion, health, everything.
It's a systemic impact, far beyond just PTSD symptoms.
So given all this, the limits of talk, the limits of drugs, the complexity, the embodiment, where did the search for healing start to go?
Back to basics, in a way. Back to that idea of needing to sense, name, and identify what's happening inside, which, ironically, many mainstream treatments ignored.
And realizing that things like standard CBT or exposure therapy could actually backfire with complex trauma.
Yeah, they could just overwhelm the system, reactivate the alarm, shut down the parts needed to process it. Change seemed to require opening up to inner experience, learning to tolerate sensations, noticing they pass. Mindfulness became key, just calming the system enough to even approach the past safely.
And addressing that inner void, the feeling of being unwanted, unseen.
That lack of agency and self-worth that comes from early neglect or invalidation. How do you build that up?
Which led to exploring things beyond just talking, like Bessel psychomotor therapy.
Right. Not about explaining the past, but experiencing something different in the present. Using role play with ideal figures to provide missing emotional experiences.
Like Maria feeling the relief of an ideal mother standing up for her.
Exactly. Or Mark expressing his rage safely and realizing his fear of the rage. It's like rescripting key scenes in your life movie, focusing on the felt sense now.
Theater programs, too, especially for kids.
Building competence, connection, understanding cause and effect by seeing it played out. That quote from the director, Paul, is powerful. You cannot help, fix, or save. Work side by side. Give them back control.
Healing without even naming trauma. Focusing on, what does this mean to me? What effect do I have?
Experiencing agency within the role. Tina embodying her mother, changing the narrative, feeling that physical release. It's embodied change.
Then there's neurofeedback, working directly with brainwaves.
Building on early EEG work. The idea that you could train the brain to regulate itself better. McFarlane's study showing PTSD patients struggle to integrate sensory info.
Like the soldier in Hurt Locker. Brilliant under fire, but lost in the supermarket.
Maybe neurofeedback could help bridge that gap. Lisa's story is compelling, calming down, less dissociation, actually using her feelings, getting out of constant fight or flight.
Yeah.
Directly targeting brain regulation.
And yoga therapy, clearly body-focused.
Linking to the vagus nerve, nervous system regulation. That NIH study showing it helped even when other things failed. The focus on breath, tolerating sensation, body awareness.
Interoception, sensing yourself.
Right, Annie's story. Noticing triggers and poses, but using breath and awareness to stay present. Use the sensations as information. Rebuilding that relationship with the body.
And finally, internal family systems, IFS.
Seeing the mind as a family of parts managers, firefighters, exiles holding the pain. Trauma makes them extreme, fight each other.
But underneath is the self.
Yeah, this core of calm, compassion, confidence. IFS works by getting curious about the parts, creating space, understanding that protective intentions, and letting the self lead. Joan hating her weak part, Peter's critical part being afraid.
It's about internal leadership, self-compassion. That RA study showed it helped people live better with their disease by changing their relationship to their internal experience.
So all these paths, movement, role play, brain training, internal dialogue, they go beyond just talk or meds. They engage the body, the nervous system where the trauma is held.
Helping people become present, alive, integrated.
And crucially, almost all involve safe connection. A therapist, a group. Healing that social engagement system that trauma wrecks is fundamental.
Wow. Okay, we have definitely gone deep into Chapter 2, from the initial confusion and lack of tools.
So these foundational insights about the brain, the body, relationships, and how trauma reshapes everything.
The core takeaway feels like this massive shift. Trauma isn't just a mental issue. It's an embodied physiological reorganization based on survival.
And it affects everything: imagination, safety, health, connection. Understanding that embodied nature is absolutely critical.
And it opens up entirely new avenues for healing, ways that work with the body, not just against the symptom.
Exactly. We really hope this exploration has been insightful for you listening.
Yeah, if you found this valuable, if it connected some dots for you, please do hit that like button. It lets us know this kind of deep dive is useful.
And definitely subscribe if you want to keep exploring complex ideas like this with us, getting right into the source material. We've got more deep dives planned.
So as we finish up thinking about this chapter, here's maybe a final thought to chew on, building on everything we've discussed about fragmented embodied memory.
If trauma lives on as these raw, split-off sensations and feelings lodged in the body, keeping the alarm system primed, can we ever truly leave the past behind unless healing involves finding ways to help the body itself finally process, integrate, and complete those unfinished survival responses?